Why did they always look at her like that? Like she'd wandered into the wrong world. Like she didn't belong where the air smelled of salt, discipline, and old ghosts. Rachel White adjusted the strap of her red jacket as she walked toward the east gate of the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The morning sun hit the concrete like a mirror, the ocean breeze carrying a faint hum of cadence from some unseen training run down the beach. The sound used to feel like home. Now, it was just a reminder. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside." The voice came sharp, too sharp for someone so young. She turned. The sailor couldn't have been older than 20. His uniform was crisp, but his confidence still had training wheels. His name tag read Davis. His hand was raised, palm out, like a stop sign that believed it could halt a hurricane. Rachel stopped, silent. She'd been here before, not this gate, not this boy, but this moment. The kind where patience and pride collided. She held out her Department of Defense identification card between two fingers. The plastic was cold against her skin, worn smooth by time and habit. "Just here to visit the memorial," she said evenly. Her voice was calm, practiced, the kind that didn't beg or explain. Davis glanced at the card for half a second, then his eyes snagged on something else. The sleeve of her jacket had ridden up, revealing a tattoo, small, dark, etched into the skin of her forearm. The Navy SEAL trident. The eagle with its wings outstretched, clutching anchor and pistol. It looked old, lived in, like it had survived more than the skin that carried it. The boy smirked. "Nice ink," he said. "Big fan, huh?" He leaned in slightly, conspiratorial in tone, but loud enough for the nearby sailors to hear. "My cousin, into that stuff too, got the same one. But you can't walk in here with a civvy ID and a fan tattoo. This is a secure facility." Rachel didn't flinch. "It's not a civilian ID," she said quietly. "It's a retired credential." He took the card, held it up to the light like it might confess something. "Retired," his grin widened. "You look a little young to be retired, ma'am." The word "ma'am" landed wrong, not respectful, just condescending. He called over his shoulder, "Hey, Miller, get over here. We got a retired admiral or something." His buddy ambled over, gum in mouth, every step oozing laziness. "What's the story?" "Claims she's retired military," Davis said, his voice dripping with amusement. "But this card doesn't pass the eyeball test." Miller gave a slow, theatrical once-over, from her blonde hair to her scuffed running shoes. "Retired from what? The book club." The laugh that followed was small but sharp. It cut through the air, and Rachel felt it like a knife that didn't draw blood but left a mark anyway. She didn't respond. Didn't need to. She just held the card out again, the steady hand of someone who'd learned long ago that silence had more gravity than anger. The petty officer sighed, taking the ID. "Spouses of dependents gotta use the visitor center. Your husband can sponsor you on." Rachel's hand didn't move. "Scan it," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Scan the card, it's in the system." Her tone didn't rise. It didn't have to. Beneath the quiet was something harder, older. Something the two young men had never earned the right to recognize. The boy's smirk faltered, just a little. Then it came back, stronger, masking the unease. "Lady, I don't have time for—" But he stopped mid-sentence, pointing toward her arm again. "You know, wearing that tattoo is kind of a big deal," he said, almost accusingly. "People die for that trident. You don't just ink that on because you think it looks cool or because your boyfriend was on a team." That last word hung in the air, a careless cruelty he didn't even know he'd thrown. A few sailors walking past slowed, curiosity turning to gossip. Rachel's face didn't move, but a muscle in her jaw flicked once. Years of self-control pressed tight beneath the skin. The air thickened with something unspoken. "Scan the card," she repeated. Her voice dropped half an octave, no anger, just iron. The sound of authority without the badge. Miller stepped forward. "Okay, that's enough. Ma'am, you're causing a scene." "I'm not causing anything," she replied. "You're assuming." Davis rolled his eyes and snatched the ID. Fine, you want it scanned, you got it. He stomped toward the small guard shack, muttering something under his breath. He swiped the card. A red light blinked. Access denied. A smirk spread across his face. Denied, he said. Just like I thought. Now you can walk away or I can call the MPs. Trying to gain access with fake credentials. That's a federal offense. The word fraudulent hit her like a backhand across years of silence. Fraudulent. After everything she'd done. After the oaths she'd taken. After the blood she'd scrubbed from her gloves in the dust of Helmand. The crowd had grown, a few sailors lingering, pretending not to watch. The story was already writing itself in their heads. A wannabe, a fangirl, a fraud. Rachel extended her hand calmly. There's a problem with your system. Make a phone call. Oh, I'll make a phone call, Davis said with mock sweetness. But you're not gonna like who picks up. He leaned closer. Seriously, lady, that tattoo's a disgrace. My instructors would have torn it right off your skin. And then he made the mistake. His finger brushed the edge of her tattoo. A light touch, not aggressive, just thoughtless. But for her, it wasn't a touch. It was a trigger. The California sun vanished. The bright air turned to dust and smoke. The asphalt under her shoes became hot sand. She heard the crackle of comms, the metallic click of her EOD tools, the smell of ozone, the distant hum of a drone circling overhead, and a voice, calm, deep, steady, echoing through the static of memory. Easy, Ray. Steady hands, just like we practiced. Then silence. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. She blinked, breathing once deep and slow, like surf pulling back before a wave. Behind the small crowd, 50 yards away, someone else was watching. A man who'd been sitting quietly on a bench near the gate, coffee cooling in his hand. His uniform bore decades of wear, faded tan, ribbons muted by time. Master Chief Thorne. He'd seen 1,000 faces come and go through this gate, but this one stopped him cold. It wasn't her looks. It was the way she stood, not relaxed but at ease, a stance only those trained to stay alive ever truly learned. Then he saw the tattoo, faded, old, correctly placed, not fan art, lived history. And when he heard the name Davis read aloud, Rachel White, the word slammed into his chest like a shockwave. White. He knew that name. Lieutenant Commander Mikey White, SEAL Team 3, KIA 2013, married to an EOD tech, one he'd heard was tougher than anyone in her platoon. Rumors said she'd been there when it happened, that she'd stayed behind, diffusing the chain that killed him. Thorne's coffee hit the ground. He was already pulling out his phone. His fingers scrolled to a contact that rarely got used but always answered. Evans, came the voice on the other end. Commander, Thorne said, his tone low, urgent. You need to get to the east gate, now. What is it? The inspection team early. No, sir. Thorne swallowed, glancing at the scene, the crowd, the red jacket, the trident. It's Rachel White. There was a pause, the kind that carried weight. Say again, Master Chief. You heard me. They're about to call the MPs on her. Stolen valor accusation. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was gathering. In the headquarters across the base, Commander David Evans sat frozen. His hand hovered above a report he'd been reading. Then, without a word, he snapped it shut. Pull up the service record for a Master Chief Rachel White, EOD, he ordered his aide. Seconds later, the screen glowed with a file. Her face stared back, younger, dust-covered, steady-eyed. The kind of eyes that looked through the storm and never blinked. EOD Master Chief. Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Joint Commendations, SEAL Team 3 Attachment, 8 deployments. Evans' jaw tightened as his eyes caught the linked profile at the bottom. Lieutenant Commander Michael White, KIA. The picture showed them together, arms around each other, smiling like the world hadn't yet asked them to bleed for it. Evans stood abruptly. Get my vehicle, he barked. Now, and find the command Master Chief 60 seconds ago. Back at the gate, Davis had his thumb on his radio, about to call for military police. Rachel didn't move, didn't blink. "Last chance, ma'am," he said, trying to sound official but trembling just slightly. "Walk away now and I'll forget this ever happened." Her silence unnerved him, so he raised his voice louder so everyone could hear the performance. Impersonating a senior NCO, trying to access a secure facility, fraudulent insignia, that's a long list of felonies. The last word hadn't even finished echoing when a low rumble cut through the air. Engines, powerful, synchronized, growing louder. Around the corner came a convoy, 2 black Suburbans and a command truck moving fast and deliberate. No sirens, no chaos, just quiet purpose, the kind that made the world step aside. The vehicles stopped in a formation that looked almost ceremonial. The first door opened before the tires stopped rolling. Out stepped a man whose presence changed the temperature of the air. Commander Evans. His uniform immaculate. The silver eagles on his collar caught the sun like a blade, and on his chest, the trident. The gate went silent. Even the seagulls above seemed to pause. Evans didn't look at the guards, didn't acknowledge their panic. His gaze found Rachel instantly, as if the years between wars had never happened. He walked forward, slow, deliberate, each step an echo of authority honed by loss. And when he stopped in front of her, just 2 feet away, the world held its breath. Then he saluted. Not a nod, not a courtesy, a perfect glass-sharp salute. "Master Chief White," he said quietly, the title cutting through the stunned silence. "On behalf of the command, welcome back to Coronado. It's an honor to have you here." No one spoke, not even the wind. Rachel's hand rose in return, steady, respectful. "Commander," she said softly, "just came to visit the memorial." Evans held her eyes, and for the first time, the young guards realized what they'd done and who they had tried to humiliate. Their world began to tilt. What happens when silence says everything words can't? The base had gone still. The hum of activity, the clipped footsteps, distant radio chatter, the rhythm of 1,000 daily duties, had all faded into the background. Every eye at the east gate was fixed on the same impossible image. The commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare saluting a woman they just accused of stolen valor. Davis felt his stomach twist. The red jacket, the soft-spoken voice, the faded tattoo, it all suddenly looked different. It wasn't decoration. It was history, and it carried weight he couldn't even measure. Commander Evans held his salute for 1 beat longer, his eyes locked with Rachel. The sharp California sunlight hit the gold of the trident on his chest, glinting like a reflection of something sacred. Then, with slow precision, he lowered his hand. His voice, when it came, was calm, but edged with restrained fury, the kind that came from men who had seen too much to waste anger on noise. "Master Chief White," he said evenly, "you're clear to proceed." He turned not toward Rachel, but toward the 2 frozen guards. "Petty Officer Davis," he began, his tone dropping like a stone in still water, "do you have any idea who this is?" The words weren't shouted, but they hit harder than any yell could. Davis' mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked like a man watching the ground give way beneath his feet. Commander Evans didn't wait for an answer. His voice rose just enough for everyone in earshot, and there were plenty now to hear. "This is Master Chief Rachel White, explosive ordnance disposal technician, retired, 24 years of service to this Navy. She's forgotten more about courage and sacrifice than you've had time to learn." He took 1 step forward. The sound of his boots on asphalt was like punctuation, sharp, final. "She deployed 8 times, he continued. "She personally disarmed over 200 IEDs in combat zones, each one a heartbeat away from ending her life and the lives of the men around her." The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to still. For 3 of those deployments, Evans said, his voice tightening, she was attached to SEAL Team 3. My team. She went where we went, walked point on missions no one else wanted, cleared our path through minefields so we could bring our men home. And when her husband, Lieutenant Commander Michael White, was killed leading his team in Helmand Province, she stayed behind under fire to disable the device that killed him. He stopped speaking for a moment. The silence carried the weight of everything unspoken, the images, the pain, the ghosts that hovered at the edge of memory. She earned that trident, Evans said quietly, pointing to her tattoo, with her own blood. The words landed like a verdict. The humiliation flipped, turning from her to them. Miller stared at the ground. Davis felt every beat of his pulse in his ears, heavy and uneven. He wanted to disappear, to step backward through time and undo every smirk, every word. But it was too late. Evans turned toward his command master chief, a broad-shouldered man with calm eyes that had seen enough to recognize shame when it stood right in front of him. "Relieve them of duty," Evans said softly. "Effective immediately." The command master chief nodded once. "Aye, sir." As Davis and Miller were escorted away, Rachel finally spoke, not to them but to Evans. "The standard," she said quietly. "It's not higher for us, it's not lower, it's the standard." Evans looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long time, neither of them moved. 2 veterans, standing in the sunlight of a base that had seen too many heroes fade quietly into memory. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture that carried more weight than a speech ever could. Her words hung there, not a reprimand, not a defense, but a truth, one that belonged to every rank, every generation. The crowd began to disperse slowly, uncertainly, their faces a mix of embarrassment and awe. The story that would ripple through the base before sundown had already begun forming in whispers. She wasn't faking it, she was one of them. She was the real deal. But Rachel didn't care about the whispers. Her focus was fixed on something beyond the gate, the memorial. A slab of black granite set against a manicured stretch of grass. Names carved into its face, names that caught the sunlight just enough to glimmer like small, steady stars. She'd come to see one name in particular. She always did when she found herself back in Coronado. But now, it felt heavier, like she'd already lived through a battle she hadn't planned to fight. Evans walked beside her quietly as they crossed through the gate. No ceremony, no escort, just 2 people bound by the weight of a shared uniform and too many funerals. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that," he said finally, voice low. Rachel didn't look at him. "You can't fix what they don't know," she said. "You just teach them better." He studied her for a moment. The calmness in her tone wasn't detachment. It was discipline. The kind that came from years of holding herself together when the world tried to tear her apart. The memorial stood before them now. The sound of the ocean carried faintly in the wind, mingling with the distant rhythm of a training run. Young voices shouting in unison, strong, eager, unaware. Rachel stopped at the edge of the stone. Her reflection stared back, faint, distorted, a ghost superimposed over the engraved names. Her eyes lingered on one. LTCMDR, Mikey White, SEAL Team 3, KIA 2013. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the quiet ache of repetition. She stood here before. She'd read those letters enough times to know every groove by heart. The sunlight made the etched words gleam, like they were alive for a moment before fading back into shadow. Behind her, Evans stood silently. There were no words to give her, no comfort that wouldn't sound hollow. "You know," Rachel said softly, her eyes still on the stone, "the day after they brought him home, I tried to scrub the sand off my hands. I couldn't. It was in the seams of my gloves, my nails, my skin. I thought if I could wash it away, the noise would stop." Her voice broke slightly, then steadied. "But it never really leaves you. Not the sound, not the smell, not the moment you realize you're the last one standing." Evans nodded once. the kind of nod soldiers used when there was nothing else to give but understanding. Rachel exhaled slowly, the wind catching her hair and carrying it across her face. "They see a tattoo," she said. "They don't see the promise behind it." Evans turned his eyes to the memorial. "They will," he said quietly. "After today, they will." A few feet away, Master Chief Thorne stood at attention, watching silently. He hadn't approached. He didn't need to. He understood the sacredness of what stood between them and that black granite. For a while, no one moved, just the sound of flags snapping in the coastal wind. Then Rachel reached out and traced the letters of his name with her fingertip. Her touch was light, reverent, the way someone might touch a memory they weren't ready to let go of. She whispered something under her breath, a name, a prayer, maybe both. Then finally she stepped back. Evans broke the silence. "You planning to stay in town long?" "Just today," she said. "I'm flying back tonight." He nodded. "If you ever want to come speak to the new class, I'll make it happen." She gave a faint smile. "Not my kind of audience." He chuckled once quietly. "You'd be surprised. They need to hear from people like you." Her eyes softened. "People like me." "People who understand that courage isn't about the noise," he said. "It's about the quiet after." They both fell silent again, their gazes returning to the memorial. The waves crashed faintly in the distance, carrying a rhythm that felt timeless, like the pulse of memory itself. When Rachel finally turned to leave, the weight of the morning pressed against her shoulders, but not in the same way. It wasn't shame or anger anymore. It was something else, resolve. She walked past the gate again, her head high, her steps unhurried. The same red jacket, the same trident, but now every sailor who saw her straightened slightly, instinctively, without quite knowing why. The sun was higher now, the day fully awake. Davis and Miller were gone from their posts, replaced by two new faces who looked wary, alert, a little older than they had that morning. Rachel paused briefly near the guard shack, looking back once toward the base, toward the ocean that had defined so much of her life. There was a peace there, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Behind her, Commander Evans stood watching, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't speak, didn't call after her. He knew some people carried ghosts they couldn't share. He also knew she just taught the entire base a lesson that no briefing ever could. As she walked toward her car, the wind caught her sleeve, lifting it again, revealing the trident. The ink had faded over the years, but not the meaning. It wasn't a mark of fandom. It was a memorial, a vow. And even after all the years, all the distance between who she had been and who she was now, the promise still held. She didn't need to say it aloud. Her silence had already spoken louder than any salute. Sometimes dignity doesn't raise its voice, it just stands its ground. By sunset, the story had already made its way across Coronado. No memo had gone out, no official report had been written, but stories like that didn't need paperwork. They traveled faster than radio chatter, faster than gossip. They moved through mess halls, across training fields, whispered between push-ups and chow lines. The woman at the gate. The commander saluted her. She wasn't just a vet, she was EOD and one of ours. Every version came with slight variations, but the core was the same. Two guards had mocked a woman with a seal trident tattoo, not knowing she'd worn the uniform longer than either of them had been alive. Not knowing she'd walked point with SEAL Team 3. Not knowing her husband's name was etched in stone less than a mile from where they stood laughing. By nightfall, everyone knew. And everyone knew the name Rachel White. Commander Evans hadn't wanted to make a spectacle of it, but he didn't have to. The spectacle had already made itself. He sat alone in his office long after the building had gone quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights mixing with the sound of the Pacific through the open window. On his desk, her file was still open, not as evidence, but as reminder. He reread the line he'd already memorized. Awarded Bronze Star with Valor for actions during Operation Daggerfall, Helmand Province, 2013. His fingers traced the printed text, but his mind saw images, grainy footage from drone feeds, fragments of after-action reports. He'd been stationed elsewhere during that deployment, but he'd heard about it. Everyone in the teams had. A compound hit gone wrong, multiple casualties, an IED chain reaction. One of the worst weeks of that year. And one EOD tech who'd refused to leave until the last charge was cold. He closed the file gently and leaned back in his chair, staring at the trident on the wall. The symbol meant something different when you remembered who died for it and who'd kept it alive. Across the base in the temporary barracks, Davis couldn't sleep. He'd been moved out of his quarters that afternoon, reassigned pending review. His uniform, once a badge of pride, now felt like a costume. Every whisper in the hallway sounded like it was about him, and most of them were. He lay staring at the ceiling, the flicker of guilt gnawing at his chest like static. The scene replayed in his head again and again. The red jacket, the quiet eyes, the moment Commander Evans saluted her. Every detail burned in his memory, sharper each time. He remembered the way she'd looked at him, not angry, not superior, just steady. And somehow that had cut deeper than if she'd screamed. He turned onto his side, squeezing his eyes shut. He'd joined the Navy to make a difference, to be part of something that mattered. But somewhere between the checklists and the attitudes picked up from older sailors who never learned better, he'd started confusing arrogance for professionalism. Tonight it all came crashing down. He wasn't angry at her anymore. He was angry at himself. For not seeing her. For not listening. Rachel sat in her motel room a few miles from the base, the muted hum of the air conditioner the only sound. A soft yellow light filled the space, too warm, too quiet, too still. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her red jacket. On the table beside her sat a folded set of dog tags and an old photo. The picture was grainy, faded at the edges. Two people smiling in desert camo, standing in front of a tan armored vehicle under a blazing sun. She remembered the way the sand had clung to everything that day, the lenses, the skin, even the laughter. Mikey had said something stupid just before the photo was taken. He always did. She traced the outline of his face with her thumb. He'd been 28 when he died. Brave, reckless, brilliant. The kind of man who believed everyone else deserved to come home before he did. Rachel leaned back, eyes closed. For a long time she just listened to the faint hum of traffic outside, to the rustle of curtains, to the silence that followed memory like a shadow. And then the memory came, uninvited but inevitable. The desert, the smoke, the explosion that didn't stop at sound, it kept echoing through her bones. The radio static, the distant scream of engines, the feeling of sand grinding against her teeth, the voice she'd never stop hearing, "Stay back, stay." Then nothing. When the dust settled, she'd crawled toward the blast site on her stomach, her gloves slick with a mix of blood and sand. The air stank of cordite and iron. She'd known what she was crawling toward, but she'd done it anyway because it was her job, because it was him. 50 meters under fire, just her tools, her training, and the part of her that couldn't give up even when her heart had already shattered. When she finally reached him, she'd seen the tattoo, his trident still visible on his arm. The one he'd joked about getting too large. She laughed at the time. But now, as she disarmed the daisy chain that had killed him, the ink became something else. A promise, a tether. And when she returned home, she got the same tattoo, not in imitation, but in continuation. It wasn't art, it was duty. She exhaled slowly, pulling herself back to the quiet of the room. The photo lay flat again on the table, the past settling beside it like dust. Tomorrow she'd leave. Coronado wasn't home anymore, not in the way it used to be. But sometimes visiting the ghosts was the only way to remind yourself you were still alive. The next morning the base felt different, subtle but noticeable. A quiet hum of awareness replaced the usual buzz of assumption. The east gate had been reassigned. 2 senior sailors now manned it, their posture stiff, alert, professional. Word had reached every corner of command that morning orders would be changing. Commander Evans made sure of it. He stood in the main briefing room with a stack of files in front of him. The young officers and chiefs in the audience sat straight, uncertain why they'd been summoned on such short notice. Evans let the silence stretch before he spoke. "I don't need to tell you about the incident yesterday," he began, voice steady. "You've all heard it. You've all got opinions, so let me give you facts." He placed a hand on the podium, his gaze sweeping across the room. A retired master chief was stopped at the east gate and accused of stolen valor. She was denied access to the very base she served on for over 20 years. She was disrespected in front of junior sailors who didn't know better because we didn't teach them better. He let the words hang there. "That ends today." He opened a folder. "Starting immediately, every command on this base will conduct a professional conduct refresher with emphasis on respect, verification, and humility. Retired personnel will be verified before judgment. No exceptions. No excuses." No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet scratching of pens on paper as someone took notes they didn't want to forget. Evans looked up again. His eyes softened just slightly. "I served with Rachel White," he said. "I've watched her walk point into danger most of you couldn't imagine. And yesterday, she stood in front of 2 of our sailors and showed more restraint and grace than I've seen in some entire commands." He stepped away from the podium. "Learn from her example. Learn what it means to wear the uniform without using it as armor." As the room emptied, Evans looked toward the trident carved into the wooden wall plaque. He thought about how easily pride turned to blindness, and how often the people who'd earned the most respect asked for none of it. That afternoon, Rachel stood in line at the base commissary, a quiet errand before her flight. She wore a gray sweatshirt now, sleeves rolled down, hair tied back. She wanted to blend in. No attention, just groceries, silence, and an exit. But when she turned down the aisle, she froze. Davis stood there. He wasn't in his gate uniform anymore. He wore plain coveralls, the kind assigned to base maintenance crews. His posture was smaller now. His hands fidgeted against the cart handle. When his eyes met hers, he froze. The color drained from his face. For a second, she almost kept walking. It would have been easier, cleaner, but she didn't. He stepped forward hesitantly, words fumbling before they could form. "Master Chief," his voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I just want to say I'm sorry for what I said, for what I assumed, for everything." He stood there, eyes glassy, waiting for a judgment that could crush or redeem him. Rachel studied his face. No arrogance, no smirk, just guilt, fear, and something new, humility. "You're young, petty officer," she said quietly. "You've got time to fix this. Don't waste it." He nodded quickly, surprised. "I won't, I—" "Learn from it," she interrupted softly. "See the sailor, not the gender. See the uniform, not the mirror. You're here to serve, not to measure." He looked down, his throat tight. "Aye, ma'am." Rachel gave a small nod. "Good." Then she turned her cart, walked past him, and didn't look back. But as she reached the end of the aisle, she heard him exhale, the sound of a young man who just learned what real leadership looked like. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel smiled, not for herself, but because maybe, just maybe, something had changed. Not through speeches, not through rank. Through silence, through grace. Through the quiet kind of courage that never needs to prove itself. What happens to a person after the moment that breaks them? Do they ever come back, or do they just learn how to keep walking? The desert had its own sound. Not silence, never silence, but something deeper. A low hum of wind across dunes, the tick of metal cooling under the sun, the crackle of a distant radio. It was never quiet, not even in the middle of nowhere. especially not then. Helmand Province, 2013. Rachel's memory of it always began the same way, with dust. It clung to everything, the vehicles, the gear, the air. It coated her tongue and made every breath taste like grit and copper. It was the kind of place that punished hesitation, and she'd learned long ago hesitation was death. "EOD, you're up," someone had called over the radio that day. The voice had been clipped steady, but she heard the fatigue under it. They'd already been out for hours. One foot patrol turned into 3, one compound turned into 5. She answered back, "Copy that, on my way." Her husband's voice came next, softer but closer. "You sure about this one, Ray?" He always said her name like that, short, almost teasing, but with something protective in the tone. She'd smiled through the dust. "It's what I do, Mikey." He looked at her then, that small, knowing look that said he'd stop her if he could, but knew he couldn't, because she wasn't just his wife. She was his EOD tech, his teammate, the one who walked point into danger so the rest could live to see another sunrise. The convoy had stopped along a narrow stretch of dirt road, framed by low mud walls and skeletal trees that looked dead even when they were. Intelligence had said the path was clear, but intelligence was just another word for gamble. She climbed out of the MRAP, the weight of her gear pressing against her shoulders like a second spine. The air shimmered with heat. A local boy had waved them through earlier, a goat trailing behind him. That detail stuck with her later, how normal everything had looked. Then she saw it. A line in the dirt, barely visible, but wrong, not natural, not wind-carved. Her instincts flared. "Stop movement," she'd yelled, her voice cut through the radio noise. "I got something." The team froze. No one argued. When Rachel spoke that way, even the most confident operators listened. She crouched, sweeping the ground slowly. The fine dust shifted under her gloves, a wire faint, tensioned, leading toward the wall. Her heart didn't race. It never did in moments like that. It slowed. Every sound faded into a distant hum. Her world shrank to wires, triggers, and breath. She followed the line with her eyes to a buried charge, pressure plate, old design but effective, the kind that could take out half a squad if triggered. "Single device?" Mikey asked behind her. She didn't look back. Not a chance. They don't set singles here anymore. She found the next line, then another. Daisy chain, at least 4, maybe more. She swore quietly under her breath. And that's when it happened. A sound like a heartbeat cracking open the air. Boom! Not the one she was working on. Another, closer to the front of the convoy, then another farther back. The world tilted. Dust erupted like a living thing. The shockwave threw her sideways. The ground slammed against her ribs. For a second she couldn't hear anything but the ringing. High, endless. When her vision cleared, everything was moving at once, shouting, gunfire, chaos. And then she saw him. Mikey, 50 meters ahead near the wall she'd been tracing. The blast had hit there. Her body reacted before her mind did. She crawled, dragging her kit, ignoring the burning in her lungs. "Hold your fire," someone screamed. IED chain, but she was already halfway there. The air stank of ozone and blood. Every breath hurt. But she kept moving, her fingers clawing through the dirt until she reached him. He wasn't moving. "Mikey," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Mikey, look at me." Nothing. Her heart lurched, but the training never stopped. Because just beyond him she saw it. Another wire, another trigger, secondary, waiting. And if the medics ran in now, they'd die too. She forced herself to focus. Tears blurred her sight, but her hands were steady. They always were. "EOD working," she shouted hoarsely. "Nobody moves." Her voice cut through the chaos, raw but commanding. It didn't matter that her vision was swimming or that her chest ached with each breath. She laid her tools out on the dirt, cutter, probe, clippers. Her fingers worked mechanically, tracing, isolating, disarming. She'd done it 100 times before, but never with him lying inches away. She clipped the first wire, then another. Each click echoed in her bones. Each one meant another life spared. Her breath came slow, deliberate, synchronized with her movements. Cut, isolate, breathe, cut, isolate, breathe. She reached the final wire, the one that tied the chain together. She hesitated. Her hands trembled for the first time. She stared at the color-coded strands through her visor, one red, one black, the classic trap. A memory flickered. Mikey's voice from training years ago. When in doubt, Ray, trust your hands, not the fear. Her lips parted, barely whispering, trust your hands. And she cut the wire. Click, silence, the sound of the desert exhaling. For a long moment she didn't move. The only sound was the wind, the kind that came after death, soft, merciless, indifferent. When the medics finally reached her, she was still kneeling, her gloves slick, her face hidden behind her visor. She didn't look up, not even when they touched his shoulder, not even when they whispered the words she already knew. She stayed there until the sun dipped behind the ridge, the shadow swallowing them both. In the motel room, Rachel opened her eyes. The air conditioner hummed again. The memory dissolved like smoke, but it left residue, that heaviness in her chest, that quiet ache behind her eyes. She stood, crossing to the window. Outside, the California evening painted everything gold, sunlight bouncing off parked cars and palm fronds swaying in the breeze. It was too peaceful, too clean. It never matched what she carried inside. Her reflection looked back at her in the glass, older now, lines faint around her eyes, the kind that came from too much squinting against sun and memory. She lifted her sleeve. The tattoo caught the light. The ink had faded, but the outline was still perfect, the eagle, the anchor, the pistol. And underneath, the faint scar tissue she never bothered to cover. That tattoo wasn't for the SEALs. It wasn't for the Navy. It wasn't even for him anymore. It was for the silence, for the days she'd had to be stronger than grief allowed, for the years she'd walked among civilians who thanked her for service they didn't understand, for the cadets who looked past her, not at her. Every line of ink was a promise, a quiet defiance against being forgotten. She whispered into the fading light, "You'd have laughed at that kid today, Mikey." A small smile ghosted across her lips. It wasn't humor, just the echo of something she used to feel. Later that night, at the base, Commander Evans found himself unable to leave the memorial. He stood before the wall, the names etched in stone catching the reflection of the overhead lights. He ran a hand over one, Mikey White. He remembered the day the news had come. He remembered the silence that fell in the ready room when they said Rachel had stayed behind to disarm the chain. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Nobody could. That kind of courage didn't need words. He turned as Master Chief Thorne approached quietly, a coffee in hand. "You knew her husband, right?" Thorne asked. Evans nodded. "Yeah, good man, one of the best." Thorne sipped his coffee, watching the sky. "She's tougher." Evans chuckled softly. No argument there. They stood together, two men who'd seen too much, staring at the reflection of a woman's legacy carved in stone. "You know," Thorne said after a while, "the young ones they think respect. Something you get because of a rank on your chest, but the real kind you earn in the moments no one sees." Evans nodded slowly. "Yeah, Rachel earned more of it in 10 seconds under fire than most of us will in a lifetime." He looked toward the gate beyond the memorial. The lights flickered there, two new guards standing straight at their post, learning, watching. "Funny thing," Thorne said. "She didn't yell, didn't fight, just stood her ground." "That's the part that'll stay with them," Evans replied. "Anyone can shout. Few can be silent with that much strength." Back in her room, Rachel packed her bag slowly. Each motion deliberate, folding, tucking, checking. Military precision even in civilian life. Some habits never died, they just changed uniforms. When she zipped the final pocket, she paused, looking once more at the photo on the nightstand. Her hand hovered above it for a long time before she picked it up, sliding it gently into the front of her bag. Then she turned off the light. The darkness wasn't empty. It was soft, quiet, filled with the faint hum of memory. She lay down, her hand resting lightly over her forearm where the tattoo was hidden again. And as the night deepened, she thought about that young sailor, Davis, about his face when he realized what he'd done, about the remorse that looked almost like the kid he might still become. Maybe, she thought, that was what it meant to serve, not just in war but after it, to carry the lesson forward, even when no one was asking to learn it. The world would move on. The next day, new recruits would run the beach, shouting cadences about glory. New names would rise, new egos, new mistakes. But somewhere in the quiet corners of the base, someone would remember her story. And maybe, just maybe, pause before judging what they didn't understand. She exhaled softly, eyes closing. Outside, the ocean roared steady, eternal. The same sound it made when she was young. The same sound it made when she came home alone. And in that rhythm, she found a kind of peace. A small, fragile one. The kind built not from forgetting, but from finally remembering everything. How do you measure the impact of someone who never asked to be seen? Not by applause, not by medals. By the quiet change that lingers when they've gone. By the next morning, the East Gate looked different. Not in any way an outsider would notice. Same asphalt, same gray concrete, same salt-streaked fences bending toward the wind. But those who worked it felt it in their posture, in the weight of their salutes, in the silence between their words. The story of the woman with the trident had already become a lesson whispered at muster, repeated in the chow line, dissected with coffee and guilt. They didn't even use her name at first. They didn't need to. She was the master chief at the gate. And everyone knew what that meant. In the small classroom near the training compound, Lieutenant Avery was rewriting the next day's instruction slides. The assignment had been sudden. Commander Evans himself had called her in the night before, his tone firm but respectful. "You'll lead the new professional conduct session," he'd said. "Use yesterday as your case study. No names, just truth." She'd known instantly what he meant. Now, as morning light filtered through the blinds, she stood at the front of the empty room, rereading her opening line aloud, testing its weight. Respect is not rank deep, it's soul deep. She paused, nodding to herself. It was simple, real, exactly what the story demanded. Behind her, the projection screen displayed a single slide, integrity under the uniform. Below it, a photo cropped from the memorial, names blurred, sunlight reflecting on the black stone. She turned off the screen and looked around the room. Rows of desks filled each day with sailors who thought they already knew what respect meant. She hoped by the time they left, they'd know better. Because somewhere out there, someone like Rachel White had already paid for the lesson they were about to learn. At 900, the session began. The room filled with the smell of coffee and starch, the usual buzz of young voices. Avery waited until it quieted, then spoke. "Let's talk about assumptions," she said simply, "about the difference between confidence and arrogance." A few heads turned up, wary but curious. "Yesterday," she continued, "a situation at the East Gate reminded us that the uniform you wear today isn't the only kind of service that matters. Some people carry their service on their skin, in their scars, in their silence. And sometimes we forget that." The room was still. The only sound was the faint whir of the projector. "There's a retired EOD Master Chief," she went on, "who served with SEAL Team 3, 8 deployments, dozens of lives saved, Bronze Star with valor. She came back here yesterday to visit the memorial quietly. No rank, no entourage, just respect." Someone in the back raised a hand. "Is this about the gate story, ma'am?" Avery met the young sailor's gaze. "It is," she said, "and I want you to think about what happened before Commander Evans arrived. about what happens when ego speaks louder than professionalism. She let the silence stretch. That woman was mocked, she said quietly, dismissed, judged by the length of her hair and the sound of her voice. And yet, when she was insulted, she didn't shout, didn't flash her credentials, didn't fight for attention. She stood her ground, said 3 words, scanned the card, and waited for the truth to reveal itself. A few sailors shifted in their seats, shame flickering in their expressions. They'd all seen something like that happen before, maybe not at the gate, but in the small ways that culture let arrogance fester. Avery closed her folder. Humility isn't weakness, she said. It's the highest form of strength. It's what separates a leader from a loudmouth. She turned off the projector, dismissed. The room emptied slowly, conversations hushed, eyes thoughtful. No one joked, no one lingered, and that, Avery thought, was how you knew something had actually landed. Meanwhile, Commander Evans sat in his office, reviewing the first reports of the day. He'd spent most of the night replaying the scene in his head, the salute, the crowd's silence, Rachel's composure. The phrase she'd left him with kept echoing in his mind. The standard is the standard, sir. It's not higher for us and it's not lower. It was so simple, so precise, and so devastatingly true. He'd quoted it 3 times already that morning. Once to a training supervisor, once to the public affairs officer, and once to himself. He closed the folder on his desk, leaning back in his chair. Through the window, he could see the ocean glinting in the distance, calm and endless. It looked peaceful, but he knew better. Peace always came at a cost someone else had already paid. The intercom buzzed. His aide's voice came through, hesitant. "Sir, the retired Master Chief White, she just cleared the main gate. She's leaving base." Evans paused. For a moment he considered running after her, but then he smiled faintly. "No," he said, "let her go. She's done enough for this command." He leaned back again, exhaling through his nose, his voice soft now, almost reverent. "She's done more than any of us realized." Rachel drove in silence. The highway stretched out in front of her, lined with palm trees swaying under a sky too bright to look at directly. Her red jacket lay folded on the passenger seat beside her. The sleeve, the one with the tattoo, peeked out from the fabric like a memory she couldn't put away. She glanced once in the rearview mirror, the Coronado Bridge shrinking in the distance, then faced forward again. Leaving always felt strange, not like escape, but like exhaling, like the air behind you was heavier than what waited ahead. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Rachel White." "Master Chief," came a familiar voice, rough, low, worn like gravel. "Thorne here." She smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd still have my number." "Didn't think I'd ever need to use it," he said. "But I figured you deserved to know the commander's putting through a memo in your name. New gate protocol. Mandatory respect verification." Rachel's brow furrowed. "Respect verification." "Yeah," Thorne said, half chuckling. "His words, not mine. Means no one gets accused of stolen valor without the facts. You made that happen." "I didn't do anything," she said. "That's the point," he replied. "You didn't have to." There was a pause. Neither spoke for a moment, both listening to the soft hum of the line, the kind of silence only 2 veterans could share. "Anyway," Thorne added, voice softening, "it was good seeing you again, even if you didn't see me." "I saw you," she said quietly. He laughed once. "Figures, you always did." She hung up a minute later, the corners of her mouth tugging upward just slightly. Then she rolled the window down and let the wind rush in, the sound of the ocean fatting behind her. She didn't look back again. Back at Coronado, the base found a rhythm again, but it wasn't the same rhythm as before. In the mess hall, younger sailors found themselves lowering their voices when they joked about people they didn't know. In the training fields, instructors mentioned the Master Chief story whenever recruits started showing off. In the command meetings, Senior officers spoke about integrity with a little more weight in their tone. No official poster, no plaque, no press release marked what had changed, but the shift was real, and it began to show in the small moments, the ones no one photographed. A junior officer paused before dismissing a veteran visitor at the gate. A sailor double-checked an ID before assuming a story. A petty officer apologized to a civilian for a tone he might have used the week before. The transformation wasn't dramatic, it was steady, human, earned. And at the heart of it, unseen, unnamed, was Rachel White. Davis, meanwhile, had been reassigned to maintenance duty, sweeping the flight line, clearing debris, painting curb stripes. It was quiet work, humbling work, but maybe that's what he needed. Each morning he'd pass the memorial on his way to his new station. He didn't stop, not at first, but one afternoon, after finishing a repaint near the parking lot, he found himself standing there without meaning to. The stone gleamed in the late sunlight, rows of names carved deep and perfect. He found hers, not Rachel, but his, Lieutenant Commander Michael White. He stared at it, remembering the commander's words from that morning at the gate. She earned the right to wear that insignia with her own blood. For a long time, Davis didn't move. He just stood there, hat in hand, the wind pushing gently against his uniform. Then quietly he whispered, "I'm sorry." No one heard him. No one needed to. Sometimes apologies only counted when they were made to the air and meant. As he turned to leave, his reflection caught the trident carved near the bottom of the memorial. He thought of the one on her arm, the ink that had started all of this. And for the first time since joining, he understood what it meant to serve. Not to command, not to impress, just to respect. Weeks later, a new policy was officially posted on every base gate across the command. Directive 201B, Veteran and Retiree Access Protocol. Verification shall precede judgment. Respect shall precede response. Below it in smaller print, integrity is not optional. Rumor had it the idea came directly from Commander Evans, but some said it was written in Rachel White's own phrasing. No one knew for sure, and Rachel, wherever she was, would never confirm it. But among the ranks the message was clear. Every time a sailor passed through a gate, they saw those words, and whether they realized it or not, they remembered her. In San Diego International Airport, Rachel sat quietly near her boarding gate. Civilian clothes, a simple duffel bag at her feet. The hum of conversations filled the terminal, the kind of white noise that made anonymity possible. Across from her, a little girl pointed to the tattoo on her arm where her sleeve had slipped up again. "That's a bird," the girl said shyly. "Like my book." Rachel smiled softly. "Yeah," she said, "like your book." "What's it mean?" the child asked. Rachel paused. For a second she thought about giving the easy answer, "It's just a tattoo," but she couldn't, not anymore. "It means," she said quietly, "someone I loved learned how to fly." The girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood. Maybe she did. Kids had a way of hearing the heart behind the words. As the boarding call echoed through the terminal, Rachel stood, slung her bag over her shoulder, and gave the little girl a small wave. The child waved back, her hands sticky with juice, her smile bright. Rachel turned and walked toward the gate. And as the automatic doors slid open, sunlight poured through the glass, catching the edge of her arm, the trident gleaming faintly in the light before it disappeared beneath her sleeve. Back in Coronado, the ocean rolled on. The memorial stood, unchanging. And every once in a while, a new recruit would stop there, alone, thoughtful, tracing the names of people they'd never met, trying to understand what kind of courage it took to live like that. Somewhere in the base archives, her file would remain. White Rachel, Master Chief, EOD, retired. But her story wouldn't live on in paper. It would live in posture, in silence, in the way people learned to look twice before they judged once. because some legacies aren't written in stone or in ink. They're written in the way the world moves after you've passed through it. And sometimes, the greatest warriors are the ones who never raise their voice. They just raise the standard. How long does it take for silence to become a voice? Sometimes weeks, sometimes years. Sometimes it never stops speaking. 3 months had passed since that morning at the gate. 3 months since the sunlight hit the trident on her arm, since a commander saluted a woman who never asked to be saluted. The memory had faded for most, but its shadow lingered in the corners of Coronado, subtle, steady, alive. Rachel White hadn't set foot on a base since. Her world had become smaller, simpler. She lived inland now, in a quiet town north of San Diego, where the nights were cool and the air smelled faintly of pine and ocean dust. She volunteered twice a week at a local veterans center, running demolition safety classes for retired ordnance techs and helping with the therapy garden in the back lot. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her mornings began early, 600 without fail. Some habits were unbreakable. She'd make coffee, step out onto her porch, and watch the sky lighten from gray to gold. On clear days, she could just make out the faint silhouette of planes from the naval base heading out over the coast. Sometimes she caught herself counting the engines by sound, just like she used to before a deployment. Old instincts didn't die. They just waited quietly in the corners of your mind. She hadn't thought about that day at the gate in weeks. Or rather, she tried not to. But memory had a way of showing up in unexpected places, in the reflection of her coffee mug, in the sound of marching boots from the training ground miles away, carried faintly on the wind. Then one morning, a plain white envelope appeared in her mailbox. No return address, no stamps, just her name written in firm, unmistakable handwriting. She knew that script immediately, Commander Evans. She turned the envelope over once, hesitating before opening it. She wasn't sure what she expected: an apology, a report, maybe some formal "thank you for your service" note written by an aide. But when she unfolded the letter, her breath caught slightly. It wasn't printed. It was written, every word in pen. Master Chief White, you told me the standard is the standard. You were right. I thought I understood that phrase, but I didn't, not until you stood at the gate and reminded us what it really means. Since that morning, we've changed more than policy. We've changed perspective. We now train every sailor and officer who sets foot on this base to verify before judging, to respect before responding. It's part of orientation now, not because of rules, but because of you. Your story spread across commands faster than any memo I could write. But I want you to know it didn't spread as gossip. It spread as example. There's something else you should know. The young man, Petty Officer Davis, requested to stay in service. His reassignment held. He's been working quietly under Master Chief Thorne. Thorne says he's one of the most improved sailors on base. No attitude, no shortcuts. He volunteers for the late shifts now. He's learning. He wears humility like it's a uniform, and I think you taught him that. I can't thank you enough for your restraint that day. You showed us the kind of discipline I wish more of us had. If you ever choose to come back to Coronado, know that the gate will open not out of formality, but out of respect. Signed, Commander David Evans, Naval Special Warfare Command. Rachel read it twice, then a third time. Her fingers brushed over the paper's surface, the faint pressure of ink still visible where the pen had pressed too hard. She smiled softly, not with pride, but with that quiet, aching gratitude of someone who'd been seen, finally, for what she'd always been. She folded the letter carefully and set it beside the photo of Mikey on the table. You'd have liked him, she murmured. Evans. He leads the way you did, loud only when he needs to be. She looked out the window, where the morning sun caught the corner of her coffee cup. The warmth reached her fingers, grounding her. For a moment, everything was still. Then her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. Master Chief White, the voice was young, nervous, but respectful. Yes. This is Petty Officer Davis, ma'am. A pause. Commander Evans gave me your number. I hope that's okay. Rachel leaned back, surprised but not unkind. It's fine, Petty Officer. What can I do for you? I just wanted to tell you something, he said quickly before his courage faltered. They reassigned me to Master Chief Thorne's detail, ma'am. He's been hard on me, in the right ways. A faint smile touched her lips. He's supposed to be. Yes, ma'am. I think I understand now what you meant, about seeing the sailor, not the gender. He hesitated. I used to think strength looked like shouting, or being right, but now I know it looks more like standing still, like you did. Rachel didn't speak right away. The quiet stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Then you learned something worth keeping, she said finally. Don't forget it when things get loud again. Yes, ma'am, I won't. He exhaled, the relief audible even over the line. For what it's worth, I told my new team about you. They're different because of it. Good, she said softly. That's how you serve, by leaving something better than you found it. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the only thing that felt honest. Thank you, ma'am. When the call ended, Rachel sat quietly for a long while. There was something comforting about hearing his voice, not because she needed forgiveness, but because he'd found his own. And in some quiet way, that was healing. She looked at the letter again. Then, almost without thinking, she picked up a pen and began to write. Commander Evans, you said you've changed the base. That's good, but don't thank me. Change doesn't start with who speaks loudest. It starts with who listens longest. Every sailor who looked down that day and felt shame, that's where change begins. Shame's not weakness, Commander. It's the seed of understanding if you don't bury it. Tell Davis I'm proud of him, not for apologizing, for staying. You know as well as I do, walking away is easy. Staying is the hard part. And if those young ones ever ask what the trident means, tell them this. It doesn't mean power, it means promise. That's all it ever meant. R. White. She sealed the letter and placed it on her counter, ready for mailing. But she didn't post it right away. She sat there, her hand resting on the envelope, and let the words echo back to her. Promise. That was what it had always been. Not a symbol of conquest, but of duty, to protect, to honor, to carry the weight when others couldn't. Even now, years after leaving the service, she carried that promise like a compass. It didn't point north, it pointed home. A week later, Commander Evans received her letter. He read it in his office, the afternoon light cutting sharp lines across the desk. He didn't move for a while after finishing it, just sat there, staring at the handwriting, at the weight behind each word. He thought about the recruits he'd seen that morning, running drills on the beach, shouting cadences into the wind, full of energy, full of pride. He wondered how many of them understood what the trident really meant. He wondered how many ever would. Then he reached for the intercom. Get me Thorne, he said. Moments later, the old Master Chief stepped in, his usual stoic calm wrapped around him like armor. You wanted to see me, sir. Evans held up the letter, from Rachel. Thorne raised an eyebrow. Good news, I hope. She says don't thank her, Evans replied with a faint smile. Says change starts with shame. Thorne chuckled. She's not wrong. Evans nodded. She never is. They both fell silent for a moment. Then Evans added, you ever notice how some people lead even when they've already left? Thorne grunted in agreement. The best ones always do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded photo. Found this, he said, handing it over. Old one from the archives. Her and Mikey. Thought you might want to keep it in her file. Evans unfolded it carefully. Two figures in desert gear standing in sunlight, faces dusty and bright, her hand on his shoulder. his smile wide and unguarded, a world that no longer existed. Evans stared at it for a long moment, then slid it gently into the file. "We'll keep it," he said, "not for the record, for the reminder." Thorne nodded, turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You think she'll ever come back?" Evans looked toward the horizon beyond the window, where the ocean met the sky in a thin silver line. "She already has," he said quietly. "Every time someone learns to listen before speaking, that's her coming back." Back at her house, Rachel sat in the garden behind the Veterans Center. The sun was setting, the light warm and forgiving. Around her, a few older vets worked in silence, pruning, planting, thinking. No one filled the quiet. They didn't need to. One of them, an old Marine with a cane and a gentle laugh, looked up. "You still wear that thing?" he asked, nodding toward her sleeve. Rachel smiled faintly, rolling it up just enough to show the trident. "Every day." He nodded approvingly. "Doesn't fade, does it?" "No," she said softly, "it shouldn't." The two sat quietly after that, side by side, the sound of wind through leaves filling the air. Somewhere a flag flapped lazily against its pole. Somewhere else a car engine hummed past. Life kept moving, simple, steady, unremarkable. And that was enough. For the first time in years, Rachel felt something shift inside her. Not closure, that wasn't real, but calm. A kind of peace born not from forgetting, but from seeing her pain turned into purpose. Sometimes, she realized, dignity doesn't speak to crowds. It whispers through time, in the way people stand a little straighter, salute a little cleaner, respect a little deeper. And if that was her legacy, it was more than enough. She brushed the dirt from her hands, stood slowly, and looked toward the horizon, the last traces of sunlight sinking beyond the edge of the world. Somewhere waves hit the shore in rhythm, the same rhythm that had always been there, the same rhythm she'd once marched to. A quiet smile touched her lips. Some promises never end. They just change shape. How far can one moment travel? Sometimes, farther than the person who lived it will ever know. 2 years later, Coronado looked the same. The ocean still breathed against the shore, the gulls still circled above the piers, and the sound of early morning PT still rolled across the sand like a heartbeat. But under the surface, something had changed. You could feel it in the air, quiet, steady, unseen. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself, it just exists. At the Naval Special Warfare Center, a new class of recruits was beginning their first week. Young, nervous, wide-eyed. The kind who carried more ambition than wisdom. Among them was one woman, slender, sharp-eyed, her hair pulled back tight under her cap. Ensign Harper Lynn, 26, former combat engineer, smart, driven, a step faster than everyone else and a shade lonelier. She'd been warned what it would be like. The jokes, the stares, the subtle dismissals. "It's tradition," one of her academy instructors had said with a shrug. "You'll get used to it." But she didn't want to get used to it. On her second day, she walked through the Memorial Park on base, her boots crunching over the gravel. The morning fog hung low, muting everything in gray. She stopped at the wall, eyes scanning the names. She didn't know what she was looking for, maybe courage, maybe proof she belonged here. Then she saw it, small, half hidden by a row of flowers left from some earlier ceremony. A folded card. She bent to pick it up. On the front, handwritten in steady black ink, were 5 words. "The standard is the standard." Inside was a short note, written with simple precision. "Respect doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand." R. White. Harper frowned, curious. She looked around, no one else was near. She heard the name before, whispered among older instructors. The woman at the gate. A story told in fragments during downtime, part cautionary tale, part legend. Now holding the note, the story didn't feel like myth anymore. It felt like truth, quiet, lived in, real. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her uniform pocket. She didn't know why, but something about those words anchored her. The rest of that day, she trained harder than she ever had. Not out of defiance, but out of gratitude for someone she'd never met who had already cleared a path for her. That night in the instructor's lounge, Lieutenant Avery sat with a mug of coffee, grading evaluations. She was older now, calmer, still sharp. She led the professional conduct course for 2 years running, and every time a new class arrived, she made sure they heard the story. She never dramatized it, never made it into a speech. She just told the facts, how a retired master chief had once been stopped at the gate, mocked, and then saluted by the commander himself. How that single act had changed base policy across every coastal command. It always got quiet when she told it, not out of pity but respect. Avery took a sip of her coffee and looked up as one of her instructors, Chief Hollies, walked in. "You still tell that story?" he asked with a half-smile. "Every class," she said. "Doesn't get old. Neither does the lesson." He grunted softly, nodding. "I was there that day, you know. Didn't see it firsthand, but I heard the silence on the radio when Evans rolled up. You could have heard a pin drop." Avery smiled faintly. "Yeah, I heard she didn't even raise her voice." "That's what got me," he said. "Anyone else would have yelled, demanded respect. She just stood there." "Some people don't need volume," Avery said. "They have gravity." They both fell quiet for a moment. Then Hollies added, "You ever meet her?" Avery shook her head. "No, I don't think she'd want to be met. Some people prefer their legacy to work quietly." 300 miles away, in her small town by the hills, Rachel didn't know about the note left on the memorial. She didn't know about Ensign Lynn, or the class that whispered her name before sunrise runs. But if she had, she might have smiled. That morning she was back at the Veterans Center garden, gloves on, sleeves rolled up. The air smelled of wet soil and eucalyptus. The sun hadn't burned through the clouds yet, and the dew clung to the edges of every leaf. She moved slowly, methodically, her motion steady, deliberate, like disarming something invisible. Beside her, an old Marine named Torres chuckled as he trimmed a patch of lavender. "You ever gonna let someone else lead this circus?" Rachel grinned faintly. "I try, they keep handing me the shears." He laughed. "That's because you're the only one who knows what you're doing." She didn't answer. She just kept working. There was peace in repetition, in building something beautiful after years of dismantling what could destroy. When they finished, Torres leaned on his cane. "You going to the event tonight?" "What event?" "Base's anniversary," he said. "They're unveiling something new, you should see it." Rachel shook her head. "I'm retired from ceremonies, tours." "Yeah," he said, chuckling. "That's what they said about me. Then they put my face on the brochure." She laughed softly. "That's punishment, not honor." He grinned. "Maybe both." That evening the base held a small ceremony under the fatting sky. Rows of chairs faced the memorial, the flag behind it catching the golden light. Commander Evans stood at the podium, his hair grayer, his shoulders still straight. Beside him, Lieutenant Avery held a small plaque. It wasn't a dedication, not an award, just a statement. For every sailor who stood their ground when it mattered. Below it, smaller text. "Inspired by Master Chief Rachel White, EOD." No one clapped, no one cheered, they just stood, the kind of silence that carries respect. Evans didn't give a long speech. He simply said, "Some people change a place without meaning to. They remind us who we are, and who we're supposed to be." As he stepped down, he glanced toward the horizon, out of habit, maybe hope, as if expecting to see a familiar red jacket among the crowd. But Rachel wasn't there. She was at home, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the same sunset through a softer lens. The sky was streaked with orange and violet. She didn't need to be on base to feel it. She already knew. She'd left her mark where it mattered, not in ceremonies but in conscience. Weeks later, Ensign Lynn finished her first qualification exam. exhausted, sore, but quietly proud. She kept the note, the one signed R. White, in her locker the entire time. It had become her ritual: read it before dawn, fold it back carefully, and whisper those 5 words before heading out. The standard is the standard. Now, as she packed for her next rotation, she slid the note into her uniform pocket one last time. On a whim, she took a pen and added a line to the bottom. For the ones who came before. She folded it again and tucked it under her gear bag. Later that day, she left it at the memorial exactly where she'd found it. And so the cycle began again. The words that started at a gate now lived on in paper and ink, in training and silence, carried by hands that would one day pass them forward again. Back in her town, Rachel received another letter, smaller this time, written in the careful handwriting of someone younger. Master Chief, you don't know me, but you changed how I see the uniform. I found your note at the memorial. I want you to know I'll carry it wherever I go. Respectfully, Ensign Harper Lynn. Rachel read it 3 times, then smiled. She folded it gently and placed it beside Commander Evans' old letter, 2 voices from 2 different generations, bound by the same lesson. She leaned back in her chair, the sun warm against her face, and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Sometimes you don't need to raise an army to change the world. Sometimes you just have to remind it how to listen. Months later, the trident on her arm had faded to a softer shade, almost blending with her skin. But every time she caught sight of it, it reminded her of everything it represented: service, sacrifice, and the simple act of standing her ground when it counted most. She'd never been one for legacy. But now, legacy had found her anyway, not through medals, but through people she'd never meet. Somewhere in the Pacific, a team would whisper her name before deployment. Somewhere in a classroom, a young sailor would repeat her words like a quiet oath. Somewhere, a commander would pause before assuming. And somewhere on a base at sunrise, a note would wait beside a memorial wall, carrying 5 words that had outlasted every rank and regulation. The standard is the standard. Rachel smiled as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the porch. The sound of the ocean carried faintly in the distance, timeless, familiar. She didn't need to see the waves to know they were still there. She lived her life like them, steady, enduring, shaping everything they touched. Some promises, she thought, never end. They just echo. When does a story end? When the person leaves, or when the echo fades? Sometimes neither. Sometimes it just changes form. It had been 5 years since Rachel White last stepped through the gates of Coronado. 5 years since the sunlight caught her trident tattoo, since a commander froze in silent recognition. 5 years since a base and a culture learned what respect really looked like. Now her hair was streaked with silver, cut short to her jawline. The edges of her hands showed the faint tremors of time, the kind that come not from weakness, but from a life spent doing things that mattered. She still lived in the same quiet town, still worked at the Veterans Garden, still began her mornings with the same black coffee and that same horizon. But today, something different waited in the mail. A letter thick and formal, with a navy crest embossed on the front. She frowned slightly, slicing it open with her thumb. The paper inside was heavy, official, but when she unfolded it, she saw a name she recognized at once. Commander Harper Lynn, U.S. Navy. Her brows lifted, the young ensign who'd written to her years ago. The letter began simply. Master Chief White, we've never met, but your words reached farther than you know. When I joined Coronado years ago, I found your note at the memorial. I kept it with me through every deployment, every storm, every doubt. It reminded me that respect doesn't demand volume. It earns it through silence and consistency. I've just been assigned command of the new Integrity and Ethics Division at Naval Special Warfare Command. Commander Evans retired last year. On his last day, he handed me your file and said, "Never let them forget her." Next month, we're dedicating a new training hall on base, not to medals, not to missions, but to the people who change the way we lead. The plaque bears your name. We'd be honored if you attended the ceremony. Respectfully, Commander Harper Lynn. Rachel read it twice, then once more. Her eyes lingered on the words, "Never let them forget her." A slow exhale escaped her lips, somewhere between disbelief and quiet gratitude. She set the letter down gently on the table beside her coffee cup. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at it, the morning light filtering across the floorboards. She wasn't one for ceremonies. She said that before. But something in those words, in the thought of a young woman standing at the same memorial where her story began, stirred something deep within her. Maybe it wasn't about her anymore. Maybe it was about what came after. She reached for her jacket, the old red one, and smiled faintly at the faded sleeve. The day of the ceremony came clear and calm. The base shimmered under a soft coastal haze, the air filled with the distant rhythm of gulls and waves. Guests arrived quietly, no fanfare, no parade, just simple respect. Rachel stepped through the east gate alone, the same gate where it had all begun. The same concrete, the same guard booth, though newer now, digital panels where once there had been clipboards and scanners. The young sailor at the booth straightened when he saw her credentials. His eyes flicked to the name, then up to her face. Recognition hit a second later, not from a photo, but from the story. He swallowed. "Ma'am, are you?" She smiled softly, "Just visiting." He hesitated, then stepped back, straightening his spine, his voice steady but reverent. "Welcome home, Master Chief." She nodded once. No more words were needed. Inside the new hall, sunlight poured through wide glass windows. The air smelled of new wood and ocean salt. Rows of sailors and officers filled the seats, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn. At the front stood Commander Harper Lynn, older now, composed, her uniform gleaming with quiet dignity. Behind her, a plaque waited under a blue cloth. When the ceremony began, she didn't start with introductions. She started with a question. "Do you know what leadership sounds like?" she asked. A pause. "It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands silent at a gate." The room stilled. "Years ago," she continued, "a woman taught this base and this Navy that integrity isn't proven by the voice that yells the loudest, but by the one that doesn't have to." She glanced at Rachel, who sat quietly in the second row, head slightly bowed, hands folded. She didn't demand respect. She earned it by being exactly who she was, consistent, calm, unshaken. And in doing so, she changed how we all carry this uniform. Harper gestured toward the plaque. "It's easy to follow orders, harder to set a standard." She did both without ever meaning to. Then she pulled the cloth away. The metal plaque gleamed under the light. The engraving was simple. Rachel White, Master Chief EOD Ret. The standard is the standard. For reminding us that strength speaks quietly. No applause, no music, just silence, heavy, alive, reverent. Rachel sat perfectly still, her throat tight, her eyes shining with restrained emotion. She didn't want to cry, not here, but she did let one tear slip, tracing a slow, deliberate path down her cheek. Harper stepped forward from the podium, walking to her. She didn't salute. She just stopped in front of her, extended her hand, and said softly, "Thank you for giving the rest of us something to follow." Rachel shook her hand, her grip firm, steady. "Don't thank me, Commander," she said quietly. "Just keep it alive." Harper smiled. "We already have." Later that evening, after most of the crowd had gone, Rachel lingered. The hall was quiet now, just her and the plaque. The sunlight had shifted, casting golden streaks across the floor. She reached out, her fingers brushing the engraved words. The metal was cool under her touch. It wasn't pride she felt, it was peace. The kind that comes when you know your purpose outlived your presence. She turned to leave but paused at the door, glancing once more at the plaque. 5 words, simple and eternal. The standard is the standard. She whispered them under her breath, not for anyone else, just for herself. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere earned. Outside, the evening sky stretched wide and endless. The air smelled of sea spray and distant rain. She walked along the pier, her footsteps soft against the wooden planks, waves murmuring beneath. Every few seconds, the horizon blinked with light from the lighthouse, steady, rhythmic, patient. It reminded her of him, of Mikey, of all the ones who'd gone before. For a moment she closed her eyes and imagined him there beside her. Not a ghost, not a memory, just presence. Silent, proud, whole. "Guess we did okay," she murmured. The wind carried the words away. The next morning, at sunrise, a new class of recruits gathered for their first briefing. Among them stood a young woman with dark hair tucked under her cap, her expression nervous but determined. On the wall behind the podium, a large framed quote hung above the flag. "Integrity doesn't need witnesses. It just needs you to hold the line." MC Rachel White. The recruits stood quietly, reading it in silence. They didn't know the full story yet. They didn't know the gate, or the tattoo, or the salute that stopped a commander in his tracks, but they would. Every instructor would tell it again, softly, humbly, faithfully, because some stories were too important to fade. And as the class dispersed, that same young woman glanced once more at the quote and whispered, "The standard is the standard." Back at her home, Rachel sat on her porch again, her coffee steaming in the early chill. The world was still. Her hands rested on her knees, her eyes watching the line where sky met ocean. She thought of everything, the silence, the lessons, the lives her story had brushed against, and she realized something simple and beautiful. She'd never wanted recognition. She'd wanted remembrance, not of her but of what mattered. Integrity, respect, dignity, the quiet strength that outlasts noise. The sunlight broke over the water, spilling warmth across the porch. The trident tattoo on her arm caught the light again, faded, softened, but still there. It shimmered faintly before disappearing under the fabric of her sleeve. She took a long breath, slow and full. Then she whispered, not to the sea, not to anyone, just to the morning. "Some things don't end, they just keep teaching." The wind stirred, the waves answered. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt something she hadn't felt since she'd left the service, peace that didn't need purpose to exist. Because some stories, she finally understood, aren't meant to end at all. They're meant to keep living quietly. Each time someone chooses respect over pride, listening over judgment, silence over spectacle. That's where her story would live, not in halls, not in plaques, not even in the ink on her skin, but in the unseen decisions of those who came after. Every salute done right. Every voice held back when ego tempted. Every act of dignity in the face of dismissal. That was her legacy, that was her victory. And as the morning light washed over her porch, Rachel closed her eyes, the faintest smile on her lips. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.